Welcome back. Thank you for joining us in this first session. We haven't got one of our panelists with us for the moment. The technical difficulties that have been plaguing all of us over the past year, unfortunately restraining June Oscar from joining us, the Australian Aboriginal Human Rights Commissioner, but she will be with us shortly. Let's instead start with Judge Caren Fox, the Deputy Chief Judge of the Maori Land Court. She was appointed to the court on the 1st of October 2000 and was later appointed as Deputy Chief Judge 10 years after that. And she's located in Gisborne. What I understand, I haven't been there unfortunately, but what I'm told is a beautiful unspoiled part of the east coast of the North Island. Before becoming a judge, she was a lecturer at several universities and acted as legal counsel for treaty claimants and Maori land clients. And she's also been a presiding officer for the Waitangi Tribunal on a number of past and current claims. Judge Fox, Caren, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Can I just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, and both where the conference is centralised, Sydney, and also throughout Australia. And I'd also like to acknowledge, likewise, the tangata whenua of New Zealand. Moving on, I want to acknowledge the people who organised this conference, and to you, Dan, for agreeing to facilitate this session. Thank you very much.
Well, let's start with what this session's called, defining partnerships. How do you define partnerships between particularly governments and First Peoples?
Well, I've presented a paper which I think is online, which talks about this in some detail, but moving on to the question that was asked for this session, why are proud partnerships important? I think it's contextual, and it relates to what country we're in and what jurisdiction we all have to operate under. In the New Zealand context, the term partnership is used because we have the Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand guaranteed to Maori the right to exercise tino rangatiratanga, or the right to exercise autonomy, self-government, self-determination, pre-existing sovereignty, or however you want to define it. The Waitangi Tribunal has said as much in a number of judicial reports, and I don't propose to go into those in any detail. But that pre-existing sovereignty was recognised in the treaty, and the treaty was about the exchange of the right to govern given to the British Crown for the right of Māori to continue to govern their own affairs. That's very fundamental to how partnerships are framed in New Zealand, because it means that there has to be a recognition that most partnerships in New Zealand have to be defined by that if they're to be in any way meaningful, and if they are to step back from that to be proud partnerships. So the notion of partnership in New Zealand is an important one, and it's grown out of the work of the tribunal and the courts, and it's centralised around the notion of partnership being a principle of the treaty. The word principle is not in the treaty. You'll read the treaty, those of you who care to follow up, you won't see the word partnership. The word principle in the treaty. Principles are those that are listed by the courts and the tribunals as a result of the wording of the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975. That act explains to those who read it that the Waitangi Tribunal has jurisdiction to hear claims against the New Zealand government and to judge those claims against the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. So the wording, the principles of the treaty, is in the Act itself, and a number of other statutes in New Zealand, which has given the courts the opportunity to also define what the term partnership means in the context of our country. And they have done so in numerous decisions, which I've provided in my paper. Are you there, Dan?
I am, and I'm just about to give that big plug. It is a very interesting read. It is, and it goes into this issue of defining partnerships, and it can be found on the conference program alongside Judge Fox's bio for you to read later today or at another stage. That paper is alongside Judge Fox's bio, and thank you for providing that. It seems that in the New Zealand context, the treaty underpins everything, or most things, or many things, when it comes to partnership between the government and Maori peoples. I mean, if the treaty wasn't there, how different would partnerships be in the New Zealand context, would you say?
Well, arguably not much different, because now, of course, we've got the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which apply to all our jurisdictions. And if people would like to take time following the conference to have a look at some of those articles, they provide some very good guidance on what the standards and norms are for entering into relationships with Indigenous peoples over all matters, including things such as cultural protection, language protection, traditional site protection, the ability to access social and cultural services. States are declared to have certain responsibilities that they must follow through. In New Zealand, the Supreme Court has said that the declaration doesn't add much more to the notion of partnership that we already incorporate into the way we do things in New Zealand. So it's interesting that even without the treaty now, those states who've adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples have done so, knowing that that's now the standard internationally for determining Indigenous peoples' rights, values, and norms.
That declaration and the treaty obviously pervade and underpin much of this discussion, but it then has to be translated at all levels of government. In the New Zealand context, at a national level, and you don't have states like we do here in Australia, but also at a local level. Can you give us some examples where you've seen the translation of the treaty and some of those higher level documents translated really well into really strong partnerships between government and First Peoples?
Yes, I think it's important to recognise that you have examples in your own country, in Australia, which I can think of the land councils as an example. But in New Zealand, we have at the iwi level, at the tribal level, we have continuing negotiations and settlements for treaty claimants who settle at the tribal level. In those negotiated settlements, there are opportunities to negotiate with the government the return of lands, compensation, cultural sites, the delivery of important environmental and cultural services, matters of that type, which you'll see in many settlements, say in North America, in Canada in particular. So at that level, there are really meaningful arrangements being adopted in New Zealand, recognised by the tribes as being important to help them move through the process of grievance that they had previous to the settlement. So that's happening all the time in New Zealand, and many tribes have already reached settlement and have moved into a stage of self-governance whereby they are actively implementing those settlements. So that's a very powerful move forward in New Zealand when you think that our first treaty settlement was as recent as 1986. While there are still a few major tribes to get through, there aren't that many. That's the good news. So we've come a long way since 1986. In addition, every year, annually, you will see at Waitangi There's a place called Waitangi in New Zealand, for those of you who don't know. At Waitangi, the government now comes with members of parliament and ministers, and there's usually a meeting between the iwi Leadership Forum, which is made up of those tribes who have either settled or who are on their way to settlement or who will settle, sometime in the future, where they actively talk to each other about national issues. Now that has got to be a great step forward, because that's a recent initiative that's been happening in New Zealand for about the last 5-6 years. And it's one that should be welcomed, because it gives the tribes and the government the opportunity to talk to each other about mutual issues of concern. Then there are a range of other models that move down from the national level right through to the local government level. At the local government level at the moment, we're having a big debate in New Zealand about the issue of Māori wards, little small areas of land that are determined in terms of jurisdiction by the local government legislation in New Zealand. So at the moment, it's very difficult to create these wards, because it only needs a 5% poll, a 5% roll of voters to petition for a poll to prevent a Māori ward being created. And so it's been very difficult to overcome that potential barrier to set up a Māori ward. And so this government at the moment has introduced legislation currently before Parliament seeking to repeal that aspect of the local government legislation which permits a 5% poll being taken. But those Māori wards that are set up are in fact a model of partnership, because they give Māori people the opportunity to express at the local level their power of rangatiratanga, or self-government. So that's another model. And the Māori seats themselves at the national level are a form of partnership, even though they were initially in the 1860s imposed on Māori, who at the time were numerically the dominant population. Leaving that aside, it's a long history, I won't go into it, it's got nothing to do with today. They've become an important aspect of partnership in the New Zealand setting, because they represent Māori people in the national parliament, those MPs who are elected onto those seats. And sometimes, like the last election, 1 or 2 seats may go to an independent Māori party, and that makes the giving of advice on Māori issues in Parliament contestable, and that's got to be a good thing too.
Fascinating to hear from an Australian perspective the differences and how, in some respects, how much further it is in many of these regards. But there is always a next, and there is always ways to improve these partnerships and to build on them. What do you see as being the next steps in New Zealand to strengthen those partnerships that you've spoken of?
Right. Well, I think it's really important. I've tried to pull together a list, and it was really basically under the question, what are the fundamentals to making partnerships work? And I thought, well, it's easy for a judge to say, because we don't have to do the work at the coalface. We only have to assess what often is the results of the work at the coalface. So I say this knowing my own limitations in this regard, and it's a shame our other presenter hasn't joined, because I'm sure she would have given a much more practical example of how to do this. But it occurred to me that if you look at some of the decisions of the Waitangi Tribunal and the courts, what people are really seeking is the opportunity to act towards each other honestly, reasonably, and in good faith. And that must mean knowing and understanding the history of the Indigenous communities you work for. It must also mean enabling those people to state and pursue their own development priorities, identify where they overlap with government priorities, and in those cases adjust policies and programs around those priorities so that they meet both expectations. If the government's priorities don't meet or accord with Indigenous peoples, assessing whether those policies or practices, actions, etc., are indeed consistent with international and national standards for Indigenous rights. And where they're not being brave enough and courageous enough to tell your ministers, usually, your government heads, why they're not appropriate to be applied in the circumstances of any particular case. That takes courage because often politicians are driven by other priorities or motivations, including what the dominant pollsters might say about the situation or the dominant community itself, so popularist views. That can be really hard to compete with sometimes, but nevertheless, an honest civil servant or public servant has to tell people if a policy is contrary to basic normal standards associated with the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I really guess that in the end, you have to remember at the end of the day, you too are a public servant, or you work in the government, or like me, I'm a judge. I'm restricted by that role, so are you. We have to acknowledge our potential for conflicts in the work that we do. And where we do acknowledge that, move into giving the advice that we have to give. And then it's up to those in power to make the decisions. And sometimes those decisions will be wrong. And we've seen instances in New Zealand where they have been wrong. And I refer in particular in my paper to the Foreshore and Seabed Act 2004. The fact that it led to, well, prior to its enactment, there had been major Maori protest, big march from the top of the North Island to Parliament. Thousands of people involved in that march. There'd been a Waitangi Tribunal report saying that the legislation was discriminatory. There'd been a Court of Appeal decision which said that there was potential for Māori to file claims to the Foreshore and Seabed in the Māori Land Court and that they should be heard. Nevertheless, the government moved to enact that legislation which took away access to the courts in the way that the Court of Appeal had assumed would happen. That led to international action before the International Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. That committee found in favour of those who filed the complaint. And that in the end resulted in the democratic process kicking into gear following the election of a new government and a change to the legislation. Now, did Māori people really have to go through all that when all that was being asked for was the right to go to court? They hadn't even established their claims. So it was a denial of access to justice. It was discriminatory because it was a denial of access to justice. So sometimes governments get it wrong and we have to acknowledge it. But it's not our role other than to do what we can within the constraints of our roles to do anything about it. It's up to the Indigenous peoples themselves to decide how to resolve those challenges. Have I answered your question?
I think you've answered my question and then a little bit more. So thank you for that. And also thank you for bringing it back to the day-to-day work of many of the people that are joining us at this conference, the public servants that are dealing with these communities or dealing with these policies, and the ministers that create the policies, that create the system that we all work within. Now, June Oscar in Fitzroy Crossing, a long way from where you're joining us, Judge Fox, a very long way, in fact, had a big storm this morning and had troubles cranking up the internet to join us on this conference. Now, she is there, and I'm wondering whether you can hear me, June?
You, Dan, can you hear me?
We can. The internet connection is holding up for now. So,
Yes, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. I'll give you a. I wasn't sure if you were going to be able to hear me there, so I'll now hop into introducing you properly. June is a Bunurba woman from the remote town of Fitzroy Crossing in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, and a strong advocate for Indigenous languages, social justice, women's issues, and has worked tirelessly to reduce the scourge that is fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. She's held a raft of influential positions, including as Deputy Director of the Kimberley Land Council, the powerful Kimberley Land Council, as well as Chief Investigator with WA's Lilil 1 project addressing fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And she began her 5-year term as Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner in April of 2017. June, thank you for joining us. From what you heard there from Judge Fox about partnerships, particularly in the New Zealand context, what jumped out to you as you were hearing some of what she was telling us?
Thank you, Dan, and good morning, everyone. I was able to hear probably a quarter of what the judge shared with us. I can't help but really hear some of the common issues around the treatment of and engagement of Maori people in much the same way that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia have not been a part of the decision making in terms of policy and legislation and programs impacting the very lives of Indigenous peoples. Very common practice that governments in both countries have impacted the lives of First Nations people. There are many similarities. There are many opportunities to learn from the positive achievements of what's happening in Aotearoa-New Zealand, and how Australia might be able to adopt some of those good practice models and approaches to the issues that are commonly experienced in our country as well.
What part of those that you heard there from Judge Fox or others that you've come across in your many decades in public affairs and Indigenous affairs, what partnerships would you like to see brought across the Tasman?
Well, if I could just point to, again, the history of partnerships between government and First Nations people. Proud partnerships between government and First Nations peoples are absolutely critical to meeting the needs of First Nations communities, not only in addressing the issues that affect our communities, but to innovate and create opportunities so our communities can thrive. Australian governments have not had a positive history of partnering with Australia's First Nations peoples. Their role has been instead of one of authority and judgment, taking a one-sided, uninformed and restrictive approach, which has been incapable of meeting the needs of our communities. And historically, governments were the only party at the table making decisions on the issues that affected our lives. There was no shared decision making, no shared responsibility or accountability, and no shared impact. And as a result, there were only poor outcomes. So thankfully today we're seeing these practices and mindsets change, in my view, And as such, we are seeing positive outcomes. And when we include First Nations people in decision making, when we are informed by the lived experiences of First Nations people, and when we put trust in First Nations peoples to deliver the changes that we want to see, we see effective solutions emerge with shared responsibility and ownership, resulting in real outcomes for both parties. This is why partnerships with First Nations people are so important.
And when governments relinquish some of that power and relinquish some of that control over both policy making and service delivery, what does then a good, genuine, proud partnership between governments and their departments and First Nations communities look like in your view? And if you've got any examples that you've seen of a proud partnership working well, feel free to refer to that too as well.
Well, I have just conducted a national project in partnership with the Office for the National Office for Indigenous Australians, or the National Indigenous Australians Agency, to be correct, and the Australian Human Rights Commission, in conducting this national engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls, and as part of my role, tabling that report in the federal parliament, and that took place in December last year. It was the Wiyaniu Dangani, the Women's Voices report, and Women's Voices in my Bunuba language. And it was a multi-year project in partnership with NIAA and the Australian Human Rights Commission and First Nations women and girls from across Australia. And this project set out to capture what First Nations women and girls and their communities consider to be their key strengths, challenges, aspirations for the future. And we had the financial investment from governments into the project, and we were able to effectively engage with 100 communities and organisations through site visits and submissions, and so we were able to hear directly from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls. So, and that was the first time that had taken place in 34 years, Dan, in Australia. The last time Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women were engaged in a national collective space around governments understanding their issues but creating the opportunity for their voice was in 1986. And so being the first Aboriginal woman into the role as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, that was an immediate gap, I believed, that needed to be addressed, and we needed to bring in the voices of our Indigenous women and girls to inform governments around how we can address issues impacting their lives in partnership. And I have had a very positive response from the government since the tabling of the report, particularly from the Minister for Indigenous Australians, and excited about how we implement the 7 overarching recommendations of a huge report. And so the investment, the supports from government, working in partnership with Australia's A-class human rights institution on a project that was so needed, was a positive step. And I think it gave women and girls across the country a lot of confidence that they were being acknowledged, recognised and responded to and encouraged into a national conversation around their issues. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, thank you, June, and thank you for undertaking that work. It's funny how when you put a different person in a role, in this case, you being the first woman Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, they do come with different perspectives and different views and can see different issues. So thank you for doing what sounds like long overdue work there. We've got just over 6 minutes left on this panel discussion, and it will be we will be kicked off the discussion, Caren, as well as June, if we go over time. So we'll I'll be eagerly wrapping you up in just over 6 minutes. And if you on the conference have any thoughts or follow-up questions from what you've heard from both of the speakers in this first panel discussion, please squirrel them away and bring them to the yarning circle a little bit later on. Judge Fox, was there anything there that you heard from June, all of the thousands of kilometres away from where you are today, that resonated with you or thought could be applicable in the New Zealand context?
Oh, very much so. I just want to acknowledge the work you're doing, June. It's very important work, and I'm glad to see that many of the issues that are confronting Indigenous women in Australia are being dealt with, just as they are here. In New Zealand, we have just recently began hearings before the Waitangi Tribunal on the status of Māori women and the way that's been impacted during the colonisation process right through to contemporary times. It's a very important claim. It will give both Māori women and the Crown the opportunity to explore the extent of impact colonisation and then subsequent government policies have had on Māori women. Because like your women, our women face enormous issues and challenges, and they still remain overly represented in many of the negative statistics that you can think of. I won't go into them. The positive thing on the other side is, just like you, they exemplify many women leadership. You're going to hear from Nada Glavish in the next session, those of you who are attending the conference, and she will bring to bear all her local knowledge on issues concerning Māori people as well. So she'll be well worth listening to. So thank you, June, for that. I hope I've answered that question. Can I just say too that, like June, I really believe that unless, if you really want proud and meaningful partnerships, you really have to allow Indigenous communities to determine their own priorities in a way that accommodates their way of life, rather than expect them to accommodate government priorities in terms of their policies. And I say that because without that, by Māori, for Māori, or by people of different Indigenous groups in Australia for themselves, they'll never own the outcome. And until we all own the outcome, there'll be no change. So that's all I have to say.
Just letting you both know, we've got 3 minutes and 20 seconds before we get kicked off this panel discussion. So just lastly, Caren, in about a minute or so, what is the message, the one main message that you hope that the public servants and other people that work in the public affairs space on this conference take away with them, and then hopefully go and implement at least some of it in their day-to-day jobs when it comes to partnerships with First Peoples? What's the one main message you'd like to go away with?
One is just to remember that Indigenous peoples are resilient. We're still here in all the countries that have been colonised that are similar to ours. Still here, we still exist, we won't go away. And all the different models that we have in place, and those that you'll hear about, the very important work that's being done on the ground, all of those models while meaningful, and which we can all point to as exemplars, all have to be situated within a broader context, which is what are the fundamentals for Indigenous peoples, and that is the right to control their own destiny. And we have to find ways to make sure that they can do that.
And June, briefly from you, the one takeaway message you hope public servants take away from you today?
So, what would proud partnerships look like to me? Proud partnerships are enduring and committed to working with First Nations people. We understand change takes time, so we need long-lasting partnerships that are interested and excited, or partners that are genuinely interested and excited to be involved in tackling issues and the process of change. That these partnerships must take a whole of community approach. As First Nations people, we work to benefit our families and our communities. It's not just about individuals making it in this space. When we have partnerships that engage local people in their programs, we not only see a positive impact, but there is an empowering effect that is experienced. And so partnerships should be innovative, flexible, exciting, with big ambition. We need to test and try new ways to get new learnings. And we need to be courageous. We need to believe and have trust in one another, and confidence that we can wear any of the mistakes.
June, I'm going to have to get you to pick up the rest of that in the yarning circle, because that's all we have time for on this panel. Thank you to both of you so much.